And thank you for joining us. I'm Christine Bejerasco, Chief Information Security Officer at WithSecure. Now, I've been working in the cybersecurity industry for the past 20 years, and I've been to detecting threats, trying to figure them out, and creating technologies behind them. And what we have been quite good at is in building new technologies to combat new threats, but we keep on building more and more new technologies. So sometimes I get to thinking that now in my current role for a year, I have been always looking into technologies, but now that I'm a user, it makes me wonder, are these new technologies worth it? And today, we will be looking at, is it yet another buzzword, exposure management, or is this something that could truly help us? And I am joined today by Mo, the head of practice at Chameleon Cyber, and also a veteran cybersecurity leader, and quite an awarded one at that. Mo?
Christine, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And we also have Katie, who is the head of our attack surface management. Katie?
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, this is a topic very close to my heart. So yeah, pleased to be here.
This is going to be fun. So thank you for joining us. And by the way, during this session, this is going to be quite interactive. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please send it over. If we feel like it fits this section, then we're going to grab it. But later on, towards the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to be getting all of those questions anyway. And then we're going to do our best in answering them within the time frame that we have. So please stay tuned and be very interactive. Now, let's proceed to the first section of this webinar. And we are going to be talking about what is exposure management and what does it do. But before we begin, let's ask you, what do you think about your attack surface? So we have a poll, which should be now coming up in your screens. And during this poll, so please feel free to answer it within the next 15 minutes, for instance, and we're going to take a look at the results of this poll after that one. So take your time, give us your answers, and then we will be discussing in the meantime about exposure management. Now, the interesting thing about this exposure management is that 2 decades ago, so we have been talking a lot about the antivirus, and even today I have the luxury of holding the CISO role, and not many organizations within the mid-market actually have only the CISO role. So sometimes they are head of IT, and they can also be a CISO, and they can even be leading operations at the same time. So in small organizations, people wear multiple hats. Now, part of the work that we do is, of course, in trying to reduce the attack surface of the organization. So my challenge, with all of these different technology sprawl that we have, because new and new technologies keep on coming to help us with cyber threats, is there anything that will be removed? How will this help? Why should I care as a CISO?
Yeah, so I guess exposure management is designed to unify that view effectively. So if you think about exposure management in relation to, say, the NIST framework, a lot of the components of exposure management sit within that identity and that protection piece. So with identity, we're looking to find, what does our attack surface look like? And from that mid-market perspective, perhaps they don't have the resource to be able to do that discovery activity initially. And then in addition, we've got that protection piece. So like helping mid-market organizations understand, what are the highest priority threats to their organization? What do they need to be focusing on in terms of the remediation activities?
And then it's very interesting when you talk about prioritizing, because there are times that, of course, there are a lot of vulnerabilities in the different software that we have in the organization. And we as CISOs need to negotiate that, okay, this is critical, this looks like red, fix it. But is it really red when it's not, for example, externally exposed? So these are also the challenges that we have been facing. Do you have any insights to add to that, Mo?
Yeah, I think if we take it back to the initial problem statement and look at historically how we managed vulnerability management, it was all around CVEs. Right, and we do our scoring, we do our prioritization. And in many organizations, in my experience in working in large organizations, that is just a continuous challenge, right?
Whack-a-mole.
It is choose whatever number you want to be your threshold that you accept, and then to your point, which is really valid around that validation point, it's really time consuming. So the products will tell you these are your vulnerabilities. Then you will go out and validate them. And then from the validation, you will then go and prioritize them. And then you will coordinate with a number of teams how that gets remediated. And that was really the only way that we looked at vulnerability management. And then what we had was obviously the migration to the cloud, the adoption of SaaS systems, and then suddenly what became our perimeter was much more...
It's wider.
Much broader. And then to extend on that, we then saw things such as it wasn't just the vulnerability management, it was also misconfigurations, it is Active Directory issues.
Absolutely.
It could be also identity and access issues, because these are the techniques that we're seeing attackers using to compromise environments. So the whole perspective of the old way of doing vulnerability management doesn't exist. And exposure management is now turning around and saying, we need a holistic view of all of your estate to be able to give you confidence of where you need to prioritize.
And I think that's really powerful because we need to remember why we are doing cybersecurity in the first place. It's because there are actually bad actors out there really attacking organizations and doing something about it. It's not that we do security for security's sake. So this way, if I try to summarize, for instance, what you have been saying, it gives me a very clear way to have prioritization and to use this fact-based approach to back up why I would need people to get this done. Because there are truly the things that would sort of like break our organization apart if somebody misuses and attacks those.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And, it's also interesting because like every time we have this, there is a workload factor. So there are now very clear action points that need to be done if there's exposure management. So will this increase my workload, for instance?
So no, in theory, it's not designed to be an additional thing that you need to manage. So exposure management kind of combines existing tooling into one, as I mentioned before, one pane of glass. So it takes into consideration, mid-market teams are probably quite small. They don't have the resource to be able to manage each individual tool and consume the output. So in theory, one team could manage one tool, consume the output, and understand, what are the top priority things that I need to address today.
You mentioned earlier about identity, which is part of this, and it's interesting. Mo mentioned as well about third parties, like these SaaS applications and how that expands our external attack surface. And we know that, for example, in organizations that have SSO integration, which is like really very valuable, so identity is really the key to accessing those. What are the thoughts that we have around exposure management, for instance, Katie, that helps us ensure that there's not a lot of these attacks around identity, or at least we can mitigate those? Could you think of some examples that we have seen?
Yeah, so I guess one example would be like understanding how many credentials that your employees use have been involved in breaches. And so, how likely is a phishing attack likely to take place against your organization? So that would be one thing, and just having that understanding of, 50% of my organization have had their credentials breached. Do we need to look at other measures in that case? Do we need to think about, educational pieces alongside exposure management processes? And I think that's one of the key things around that, like understanding, it's not just about the infrastructure, you've got the people to consider as well.
And to Mo as well, I'm just wondering, how is this going to help me? Because I do report to the board. And regarding the risks that the organization has. And of course, that helps me with my budgeting. That helps me with the duty of care, like for instance, that the board has. Is this going to be helpful as well towards that?
Yeah, definitely, I think so. I think, again, if we go back historically and look at how organizations used to report, or if we look at the ownership of cybersecurity, in larger organizations, you obviously typically have a CISO. Yep. In mid-markets, you'll have an IT manager who might be wearing two hats. You might have a security manager, but there are different flavors of who owns that. And when we look at vulnerability management, or extend that into exposure management, when we look at the ownership and the responsibility of that, and I was having a discussion with a CISO friend this morning, the ownership of that isn't with the CISO, right? It isn't with security, it's with the business.
That's really cool.
It's owned by the business, right? And often I think in the mid-market space, that gets forgotten, and the IT manager or the security manager thinks that they own that space and they're responsible for it. Now, they may be accountable for in this instance, using exposure management to highlight where the risk is and be able to produce evidence to provide the leadership team with where the risks are and where we need to prioritize. But fundamentally, there might be other departments in the business that own the responsibility for that exposure. Does that make sense? So if it is a SaaS service, it is the business owner, it might be HR, or it might be the finance department. If it's infrastructure, again, it sits with the IT infrastructure team. So I think there's an element of people taking on too much responsibility and accountability. What this does provide businesses with is just simply being informed. So here's the current state of your infrastructure. Here's where the risks are. You can make an informed decision as to whether you want to do something, or whether you want to mitigate it, or whether you want to accept it. But at least you're informed.
All right.
And the reason why we say that is because many of the times when we're dealing with customers that have dealt with incidents, invariably the route came in via something that was not expected and wasn't covered, right? So it was a surprise to them in the first instance. So I think if anything that's really powerful of this is, to answer your question, yes, it is useful for the exec and the leadership because it allows them to make informed decisions and support any investment that needs to remediate that risk.
That's actually really helpful because I remember as well, I think it was Mikko Hyppönen who mentioned it, that our work in cybersecurity, it's like playing this never-ending game of Tetris, that whenever your successes, they just vanish. But the thing about this is that to continue to reinforce, for instance, that the organization spends on cybersecurity, then you need to show that what is the added value that cybersecurity is really doing, and these things is not like continuously vanishing to the background. When it vanishes, it's a success story, but you have something to show for it.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, we intrinsically as security people want to do good, right?
Absolutely.
We want to do good.
That's why we're here.
And sometimes by doing good, we take on lots of additional responsibilities that don't necessarily fit under our remit. And what happens is, it's great you're doing that goodwill stuff to take on other people's responsibilities, but I think that there does need to be a sea change at some stage to say, you're responsible for that. I can advise, I can guide, I can provide you with the information around the decision that you need to make, but fundamentally, other business leaders need to take responsibility for those things.
Absolutely. And there is a tendency for cybersecurity leaders as well to not be very good at prioritization because they want to fix all the problems.
Yeah.
And problems are not really created equal.
Yeah.
I'm curious as well, exposure management. I mean, it seems to be rising around as a buzzword, like zero trust and AI. So Katie mentioned about identity. So if we just highlight for our audience today, if you highlight, for example, the top 5 areas or top 3 areas that it really covers, what does it really cover? We mentioned already identity. There was something related to SaaS applications. Would you be able to enumerate that?
Yeah, so I guess in an ideal world, we'd include everything that we possibly can, and everything that we could discover about our attack surface, we need to know it in one single unified view. Typically, exposure management will include some form of attack surface management. So typically that would be looking at the external attack surface. Quite often we'll have components around like cloud security posture management. So, Mo mentioned previously, like we've seen a lot of shift around what organisations' IT estate looks like these days. So we need to consider that we've obviously got a lot of on-prem stuff already, but we're now shifting stuff towards more of a cloud or more of a hybrid sort of estate as well. So that's something to consider. We've also got elements of your traditional vulnerability management in there, but I guess the key thing that we've already mentioned is in terms of the methodology, we're trying to move away from that traditional vulnerability management approach, and instead we're looking at prioritization and what are the key things we need to address based on things like threat intelligence. So those are some of the key points, and I think that is on the way to becoming quite a unified view of the whole complete estate.
So it's not just a buzzword, it's really a real thing that we have. And we're going to be taking a look at the results of our poll in a few minutes. But I'm just wondering as well, Mo, I mean, it sounds like a dream come true. Why didn't we think about this before? Like, where was this? Or is this something whose time has just come?
I do. I think it's the evolution of the estate, right? This is reflective back of what the modern estate looks like. And it's more complicated, and it's more integrated, and it's all cloud-based, right? And so subsequently, you know, the technology has moved to provide everybody, and I love that term, Katie, of the one pane of glass, right? And we've all been searching, like Lord of the Rings, for that one pane of glass to rule them all.
Yes.
You know, and I'm not sure whether we're going to get there, but I love the idea that there is something that's going to give you as much visibility as you can get.
This is it for now. All right, so we have the results of our poll now in here, and this is interesting. There are 10% of the answers have been very confident about the visibility to their attack surface. Commendable.
Yeah.
Most people are in the middle. It probably depends to legacy environments or new environments. What are your thoughts on these answers?
Yeah, I think it's probably quite reflective of the organisation's maturity and sort of how well their processes are in place at this moment in time. I think I'm not surprised to see that a lot of people are quite worried about their attack surface. I think in general asset management is very hard, and I think organisations need to be quite, you know, not so hard on themselves if they can't get it right in the first time, because, you know, attack surfaces are ever changing. It's really hard to make sure you're on top of what your attack surface looks like.
And this is all about continuous improvement. It's a marathon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was asked this question recently, and they asked how confident I was around visibility of this state, I said, I'm very confident. And they said, and how high is your confidence? And I said, about 10%. So there's different perspectives that you can take on that. I think the majority of people sit in that space of being quite confident because it's, you know, it's going back to that known knowns, right? We know that stuff, we know other stuff.
Absolutely.
The reality of this is, unless it's a very small organization or unless you're on a very small infrastructure, it's invariable that there are going to be things that are never in sync, right? And Katie, to your point, asset management is the core of this, right? And it's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to do. Even in really mature organizations, it's really difficult to do. And if you are in any environment where an incident happens and you need to identify server details or infrastructure, it's invariably referring back to documentation which may not have been updated in time, right? Or it's a fluxing state. I think, again, to Katie's point, it's not a criticism. It is the reality of how our infrastructure is. This is just the modern place of work. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But at the same time, should we be responsible and accountable for knowing what our infrastructure is? Yes, we should. Is that always the responsibility of the security person? I don't think that always is. Yeah. So it is, again, another thing that's a dependency on other business units to make sure that the infrastructure and services that they're using are recorded and tracked.
And security needs to be part of what they do.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers to the poll. Let's proceed now to talking about the attack surface and exposure management's role in cybersecurity. But before we do that, let's have our last poll as well. So take a look at this poll question. Please answer it. And we're going to talk about the results of this poll as well after the end of our section. Now, exposure management, based on our discussion, if we think about it in the context of, let's say, the NIST cybersecurity framework, there's all the way from the left to the right, from govern, identify, all the way to recover. How does this fit into the framework? Where is it typically? Like, how should organizations, especially in the mid-market, then use it and view it?
Yeah, so I think it sits quite comfortably within that identity and the protection piece, really. I think, you know, as an industry, we're starting to move away from, you know, quick response and, you know, reactiveness, I guess. And now we're looking at, you know, how can we prevent things? And so, like, to begin with, obviously we've covered it already, but we need to understand what we've got firstly and what the risk is to the assets that we've got. So, yeah, I think it sits quite firmly in those two sections. And, you know, it's quite interesting to see the shift away from that detection piece into the more of the, you know, how can we prevent future breaches and incidents?
But if we think about it, I mean, it seems natural, isn't it, to spend a little bit more on prevention rather than recovery, because it's always very costly towards the right side of this framework. I mean, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have anything there, but it's just always costlier whenever you need to recover now from a breach. So you do everything that you can to avoid that, essentially. All right, so it's quite sensible. I'm curious, Mo, and I'd like to move to you at this point. As attack surface management continues to evolve, what do you think about what's going to happen to penetration testing? Is this something that's going to go extinct at some point?
I'd love that to be the case. I'm going to bite the hand that feeds me and disrupt the whole of the security industry. I think here's my challenge with where we are, with where we've got to with elements of penetration testing. And that is simply that what we see is, as part of the supply chain onboarding or customer compliance requirements, that penetration tests are done annually. And so the customer is required to produce penetration tests to provide some level of assurance to the customer that they've got their security in place. Increasingly, with the migration of everybody using SaaS services, what we often see is that actually all that you're testing is Microsoft services, right? Your penetration testing, Microsoft services, and the value of it, I get the context of where it originally started from to provide you with some level of confidence, but that for me now has dissolved, and often because when we look at customers, they'll spend an annual budget set aside for pen testing. Right? We'll call it and that annual budget is the annual budget for pen testing.
So it becomes a tick-in-the-box exercise,
so the scope is very limited for you to turn around and say, let's say, for example, we're using exposure management to supplement our risk management. We've identified that these are the threat vectors that we think are the biggest priority, and actually we'd like to allocate our pen testing to be validating this part of where we think we might be vulnerable. But that might be outside of the scope of the budget that's been assigned for you. So then organizations find it very difficult to go back to the business and say, actually, we now need extra budget to be able to do this. Because that conversation isn't tied together with that leadership conversation, this is where my criticism comes in, that organizations will be spending money doing an annual process of point pen testing, but the value return of that is really limited when it could be utilized in a better way. So for any pen testers that are listening in, I'm not saying that I want you out of a job. I'm saying that I just want you to have a much more specific and probably better scope than traditionally what we see with many organizations adopting.
Yeah, and if it becomes just a tick-in-the-box exercise, for instance, just because it's demanded by your clients, and then there's really no real value anymore to the organization then.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we find that there isn't a conversation, there isn't a mechanism for a conversation to take place with the incumbent customer. And because they're the customer's always right. So if the customer sends you a form that says, fill these tick boxes in, and one of them is, have you conducted a pen test? There isn't an option that says, if you've not conducted a pen test, have you done any of these? Have you conducted assessments to assess the vulnerability? So that option isn't there. So therefore, the business will often go, the quickest way to do this is just, let's just go get a pen test.
But that's really interesting, because I'm just wondering, I mean, we are new in the evolution towards this exposure management, but could it be acceptable at some point that if this is now your automated pen testing, then you can kind of like download a PDF from this, and this could be a replacement of your pen test report?
Yeah, well, I think we're asking, and it's part of our job as an industry to educate businesses to ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just think historically, we're still asking questions from 20 years ago that just aren't pertinent to today.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that question of, have you had a pen test or not, is not the question that you should be asking. The question is, are you aware and do you scan vulnerabilities of your exposure management, right? And have you got a process to remediate those, right? Because that's actually the answer that you want, not have you done a pen test.
Absolutely. Well, many of you know how you fill up the security due diligence questionnaires and how wonderful it is to do that. But what are your thoughts on this, Katie? Do you agree, disagree? Anything you want to add?
I definitely agree, and I love this topic because, just to give you a bit of info on my background, I've come from penetration testing.
Okay.
I spent about a year doing that and then moved into attack surface management, so I've kind of seen both sides of the fence. And so some of the key things that really stand out to me here is, like, the minute you complete a penetration test, the results are outdated. Like, as soon as we find new vulnerabilities that haven't been tested for the week before, you know, those test results are invalid effectively. Another thing is the continuation of exposure management. So with pen testing, again, Mo highlighted it quite nicely. It's a once-a-year thing quite typically. Again, we're not really understanding what threats come about within that space of the year. Whereas with exposure management, we're continuously testing, we're continuously finding out new threats. And so we can then go ahead and patch in between what would be a pen testing life cycle. And then lastly as well, around, you know, exposure management is quite current. So the methodologies around pen testing are quite outdated. They quite often will focus on quite low severity issues, things like web application tests looking for missing headers. Realistically, an attacker's not going to be exploiting that vulnerability, and instead they're going to be looking for the high impact, high sort of reward vulnerabilities that might come from things like you know, exploits against Avanti or some of the big ones that we've seen in the beginning of this year.
Do we have hate comments coming in now because of how we have responded to this, or no? Okay, we are good.
We're good.
All right. Okay, but that's actually very interesting. It is indeed an evolution, and it's interesting to take a look at point-in-time results versus something that's continuous and really gets to the root of the problem. And I'm just wondering, staying with you, Katie, as well, how do you think this will impact cyber criminals? Do you think they're going to change their methods because of exposure management?
I think we will see a shift, yeah, and I think organisations will get better at defending against those high-profile attacks. And so I wonder if we'll see a slight shift in, you know, the different types of techniques that attackers are using. But actually going back to the Avanti issue, so for anyone watching that's not aware, there was a few high-severity vulnerabilities affecting the Avanti SSL VPN at the beginning of the year. And actually, that affected an appliance that you probably couldn't deploy any agents on for any kind of monitoring. So what exposure management would have done there is identified that vulnerability before, you know, a potential compromise. So it's, again, going back to the idea of understanding what you've got. Okay, we've got 10 Avanti appliances. We know that 10, maybe like 5 of those 10 are outdated, and therefore those are the ones we need to patch before that compromise.
All right. Yes, please go ahead.
So I've got a slightly different perspective than Katie on this, right? Because I'm not as optimistic, and the reason why, and the reason why is because, you know, we mentioned this is an evolution, right? And we just see that. I think Katie's right in terms of early adopters. I think early adopters and those that are quite mature in their security understanding will see the value in exposure management and what it can provide for them. What I can't see is the techniques that are still being used today. Many of them are low technical attacks that are still succeeding, right, against organizations. And organizations aren't, I see, changing their posture significantly to defend against that. So, I still think that organizations are still going to be targeted and still going to be exploited. And exposure management is going to be one of those things that they're going to need to move to at some stage. But until they do, I think that risk still remains high in that organization. Does that make sense?
It does, and my hope can only be that they don't get exploited with one of those top priority reports that exposure management has if they already have this capability, because otherwise we're going to be slapping our forehead. I should have fixed this, but yes, you have been told to fix it already. We're going to see the results of our second poll in a few minutes, but I'm just wondering, will this exposure management, considering the relevance of this one to the organization and how it can really help, do you forecast continuous adoption of this one in the next, I don't know, 2 to 3 years, that organizations would really flock towards this and see this as something that could help them elevate their security? Yeah,
I think, like, given my experience in the ASM space over the last 3.5 years, like, it's quite quick for an industry to take off in that space in that short amount of time, really. So I think, like, given the rest of the industry understands what exposure management means and how it can benefit them, I think we will start seeing a move towards the adoption of different solutions and services and even just processes around exposure management.
All right. Good, thank you. And we have now the results, which is very interesting, and I don't know what you think. From my perspective, feels a bit predictable as well. I mean, my budget is my budget.
Yeah, we can see that budget is the highest priority consideration on there, and it makes complete sense, right? And it's for many organisations the first point of the answer to the question, right? So that's completely understandable.
There's a very interesting question here coming from our audience as well, Mo, coming from Sally. Would you implement exposure management today?
Yeah, so to answer that question honestly, as you know, as head of security practice, as my previous roles as an interim CISO and CISO, my role is to be able to identify risks across the organization, to be able to validate them, and then present them back to the business for their, for our combined view and remediation. Does exposure management help you do that? Absolutely, it does. So to that end, would I deploy it? Yes, I would, but for those reasons.
All right. Yeah. That's pretty good, and thank you for answering those polls. We are now down to risk appetite and regulations, which is, interestingly, especially like within Europe, different countries of Europe, different regulations, but they are coming in, and they're coming in hard to our different organizations. And we're just wondering, because like me, myself, coming from the European Union, I have NIS 2 coming up as well. And considering that many mid-market organizations are going to be impacted as well by that, and they don't have the luxury of maintaining their own risk register, and this exposure management, as mentioned, it's going to highlight as well more of the risks of the organization. So do you think this will impact the risk appetite of the organization?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, if anything, it will improve things. So if we think back to traditional vulnerability management processes, quite often teams would have to consume loads of output from that, and the understanding would be, okay, I need to fix every single one of these vulnerabilities. Those that have the luxury of having a register, most things would probably sit on there, and so it becomes quite overwhelming, right? So with the move to exposure management, that obviously is designed to be more of a prioritized list. And so replacing that massive list of risks and vulnerabilities with a much more concise, manageable list means that organizations are less overwhelmed. And I think, organizations can actually focus on what really matters to them and, the real risks. And
it's funny you mentioned about risks sitting there, because, risks don't age like fine wine. So, you don't collect them and age them. But many organizations, because there are no resources, there's not a lot of bandwidth, especially in the mid-market, to continuously mitigate these risks, then they are there. So what we're saying here is that exposure management should then highlight the real ones that could have impact to the organization, is that something that it can then do?
Yeah, I think it's something that actually supports the maturity of the risk register. Again, going through my experiences, we've got to a position where we like green. Everybody likes green dashboards, right? And we don't, yeah, and we don't, but the reality is we often don't live in green dashboards, right? We live in amber and red dashboards. And I think that when you go into an organization, you can quickly see how they understand risk by how many reds they're managing, as opposed to how many greens they're showing you on their dashboard. So I think, again, the idea of being given visibility is not that you need to remediate everything immediately. You can prioritize and you can make risk-assessed judgments. And this is what this continually does. It provides you with it allows you to make an informed decision about how you're going to remediate that. So I think actually, when we spoke at the beginning of this, of needing to use this to upsell your position to the leadership team and to provide them with ownership, then this actually, by doing that, supplements the maturity of the risk register, which otherwise, to your point, and I love that term of aging red wines,
they are definitely not aging well.
Yeah.
Become sour. I'm curious as well about the selling to management, because many of our CISOs come from a technical background, and it has typically been a stumbling block to explain these risks and the cybersecurity issues in the context of the business, just because of the vocabulary that many CISOs have. And when it comes to talking now to the leadership team, let's say I have my exposure management dashboard, and I can show basically like what are now my top 3 risks, very clear attack paths. It looks like, I don't know, we have an on-prem file server now that's going to be compromised. Will this help me explain, like much easily, even if there's still some technical elements in there, where the problems really are and how relatable they actually are to the business?
Yeah, definitely. And I think to go one step further, we can look at how we can apply business context to those assets as well. So, for example, you might have a server where, in fact, you might have 2 servers. One might just be hosting, you know, like image assets or something like that, relatively low risk. Exactly the same server, it might contain, you know, confidential information like banking details for your customers or something similar like that. So, you know, to be able to apply the context to those 2 different assets can then help you understand, you know, the risk is actually higher to this server because it contains this type of data in comparison to the less risky server. And so it can help you sort of articulate the risk in different ways by applying that different business context to different assets, I think.
All right. Yes.
I just wanted to elaborate on your piece about the risk management, because I think it's a steadfast thing that's stayed with me throughout my whole career. and having spoken to peers, I think nobody's got the answer, right? Culture eats everything, and the business culture will eat risk profiles as well. Yeah. Going back to the question that was asked around budget, again, if you're looking at speaking to the leadership team and putting a business case forward for what exposure management does, what it provides, what are the values, the whole business case, along with those commercials. And then as part of that implementation is going to be integrating that into the risk register and then providing the leadership team with a much fuller view of what the risks are across the estate and how they need to be mitigated, then that is, again, tying back to that piece of helping you manage that risk management, risk register process. Because often what we see is the risk register and the risk management is managed at the operational level and doesn't really get escalated because, to your point, there isn't a very clear way to articulate that. So if you can use this as a mechanism to articulate that, it helps you get the leadership team on board, helps you support funding, investment, and also allows you to just cover yourself by saying the business was aware and they made these decisions.
That's actually really helpful as well, especially to, for example, technical people who are wearing the cybersecurity hat, because they don't need to be always spending, for example, 80% of their time when preparing these presentations with business terms just to be understood, because exposure management should help them cover that as well. It gives them the explanation that they would need, which is like understandable from both sides. Going back to regulations, is there a way that exposure management could help towards compliance? That, for example, is this my tick in the box that I say I am now NIS2 compliant because I have this? Anything that can be helpful on that front?
Yeah, I think in terms of like ensuring the regulators that you've got, you know, good visibility of everything, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction that way.
All right.
But I think, you know, part of me saying, you know, we're still needing to do these regular pen tests, again, similar to what Mo said earlier. You know, I think a lot of the compliance and regulations are still quite outdated. So I think in line with shifts to approaches like exposure management, I think the regulations need to shift their approaches as well, because, you know, things haven't changed for a long time. And I think NIS2 is a good example of how new things are coming out.
Yeah.
And, you know, things need to change in line with threat landscapes and, you know, how organizations are changing their approaches as well. Technology
typically moves faster than regulations as well. So as long as the regulatory requirements are not overly prescriptive, then they should actually be quite helpful. Anything you want to add to that, Mo?
Yeah, I think to your point, we're seeing increasing levels of new regulations or evolution of regulations across the EU and in the UK, and the same in the US. So the one takeaway that we've got from this is that they're not going to stop, right? They're only going to increase. And I know there's consultation that's going on at the moment around including cybersecurity responsibilities within a director's role for owning a business. So part of the director's responsibilities will have an element of cybersecurity. I'm not saying that the exposure management is going to be a requirement out of that, but what I am calling out is there is increasing levels of legislation which is going to come out and affect business owners where they're going to have to do stuff. To your point, the questions that they'll typically ask is have you got your house in order, right? Have you got your house in order? Are you informed? Have you got visibility of the risks against your estate, right? And I'm not tying it and spoon-feeding anybody that it ties neatly with exposure management, but exposure management does form part of the answer of, do you have coverage across your estate? Do you know what your risks are? Are you managing it in a way that's aligned with the appetite of your business?
And in a way, then, it's part of the cybersecurity situational awareness, then, that you would have in your organization. Reminder to our audience regarding Q&A. So questions, please feel free to send them, because we are going to be asking that in the next section as well. But when mentioning about this, because I keep on going back to the board and the leadership team, because obviously the purse strings are only going to be loosened when you get a very compelling argument. And there is a need for directors, as you said, to take a look at cybersecurity as part of managing the risks, as part of duty of care that they have for the organization. But will this help me get more budget, like get more compelling argument? Because my worry is that, yes, I will have those top items, I will have them well prioritized, I will need to fix them. And at the end of the day, what if, knock on, I'm glad this is wood, what if we realize that there was a breach that happened, and exposure management already informed me that this is the attack path, and it happened exactly as it said. But then I made a what I thought was a compelling argument to our leadership team, apparently wasn't compelling enough, and the money didn't get released. In this scenario, can I start putting blame on people? This is probably going to be helpful in the long run, but where then does the responsibility lie? We touched upon this a little bit earlier as well.
Do you want me to say that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So we helped a customer recently who dealt with a significant ransomware attack. And part of the post-incident review was looking at the discussion, or the decisions that were made around investment in cybersecurity. And it was only anecdotal stories around we'd suggested that we should have done this. The budget was too high. We got rejected. We asked for this. It wasn't called, you know. What typically happens after an incident is everyone becomes really vague with their memory around what conversations were had, and verifying.
Document everything.
Yeah, and that's the point that I was going to get to, right? So it's not our job to do that. It is our job to make sure that those decisions are recorded and signed off.
Yeah.
So we identify, we make the business aware. It isn't really, I think, a lack on our side if we're not able to convince them or not, because invariably they've got different priorities that they see.
Absolutely.
In this instance, when I was speaking to the CEO a couple of days after the incident, and we were having discussions with him a few days before the ransomware outbreak happened, and he said to me, and I asked him, is there anything I could have done to have made cybersecurity a priority for you in the weeks before that we were speaking? He said, Mo, you were number 11 on my list of things to do. You were number 11, and he said, and I knew I had to do something. He said, but I didn't take it as a priority above all of the other business things that I did. So I think we just have to accept, right, the business operates as it does. Our job is to inform. I think this exposure management helps inform and record and track. And then after that, we manage the risk, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess this should also help because, for instance, publicly listed companies in the US and CISOs on that, after SolarWinds, there is now more requirements going towards them and bigger chance of it being a personal liability as well. So maybe this could even help towards that front, that as long as they have done the work that they need to do to inform, that at the end of the day, they have done their job, which is really all we can ask from our cybersecurity people.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to elaborate on that, as we said, you know, we got good people doing good things, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And then often there is either somebody wearing two hats, so they've got their day job plus they're doing cybersecurity, or their day job is cybersecurity with constrained resources and budget. So they are trying to do the right thing to keep, you know, do good stuff, as we keep saying. But invariably, again, there's only so much you can do before you have complete, you know, you can take responsibility of it, but you're not fundamentally accountable for it because the business is. And so it's your job to inform the business to make sure that you're, I don't want to use the word protected because it's the wrong word, but again, it is protecting yourself to make sure that everybody else made a collective decision on something and it wasn't you just pretending that the dashboard's green because you find it uncomfortable to have a discussion.
Exactly. Yeah. But that is really good. I mean, our job, for example, as part of management, is then to help our cybersecurity, the leaders of our cybersecurity in the organization, whatever title, shape, or form they have, to then have the right kind of tools that they can utilize to make their job easier. That is what we have in the discussions. Now let's proceed to the Q&A, and I am just wondering what type of questions did we get? So there was a question related to NIS2 and how does exposure management help to cover mid-sized companies? I think we answered that already, and that was from Kenneth. There's an interesting one. So Timo Sjösten was asking that NIS2 requires risk management related to the supply chains, and it does. Would there be an easy way for organizations to fulfill this requirement?
Yeah, great question. I guess it goes back to, you know, what we were talking about at the beginning, like where attack surfaces don't stop at the perimeter anymore. It's like we've got SaaS companies, third parties, anything that's effectively using the organization's data in some way to consider in this big picture of the complete attack surface, really. So, yeah, I think, you know, we have to consider how can we manage that risk as well. You know, whether it's like keeping track of what systems those third parties are using, regular audits of the third parties as well. I think that's probably something to consider. Yeah.
Well, for instance, if these third parties, if all of them are using exposure management, to your point, Mo, if they are now more mature, and these are the type of organizational circles that you accept those as part of what they submit to you, that this is their profile, then I guess we get to the point that, yeah, you can actually understand the posture around you based on this.
Yeah.
But then there's no need for pen testing.
That was the point that I was going to make, actually. I thought that tied in quite neatly. I think it's part of the supplier assurance piece. And we know that, the supply chain piece is really difficult, right? When you're either part of the supply chain or someone else is part of your supply chain. And it is difficult, but I think it goes back to, again, the questions that we should be asking for those, for our supply chain, which is not, do you run a pen test annually?
Yes.
Right, but actually, do you have visibility of, and probably the questions that we tend to lead with are, do you have visibility of your estate? Or more importantly, are you prepared that should an incident happen, you're able to respond and recover? And that includes informing us of how that's being managed. So I think, again, looking at how the industry can mature, there are some more fundamental questions that we can ask, which underpin a whole sort of understanding of the level of maturity that the business has, rather than those very sort of protracted tick box exercises. But I mean, I think the vulnerability, I think the supply chain piece, there's lots of other tools out there that help bring that together. But I think fundamentally, as Katie was saying, and yourself was saying, if everybody was using it, it would raise the level of maturity across the whole supply chain.
Maybe a little bit of peer pressure as well, like towards everyone that is in your circle. It's also in their best interest. We have one question here from Nigel. If exposure management is the answer, what other tools can I lose in order to stay within the budget? I like this question.
Yeah, great question. So I guess we already spoke about it, but I think, exposure management starts to move away from the traditional vulnerability management process, really. So as long as you don't have any sort of regulations or compliance requirements that say you need to do standard vulnerability scanning, then I think, that's something that we can get rid of and replace it with a more pragmatic approach that's offered by exposure management. And then I guess you can kind of consider exposure management to be a combination of other things, such as external perimeter scanning, and then your cloud posture as well.
Well, we can call this non-standard vulnerability scanning, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Anything you want to add to that, Mo?
Yeah, great question by Nigel, because it made me reflect on how many times we remove tools. Right. Now that's probably another topic by itself, right? Because the reason why we got to where we are today is because we keep buying new tools on top of new tools on top of new tools. But in all seriousness, I think it's part of that business case, right? It's part of that business case to turn around and say, look, the adoption of this, and again, it goes back to that budget question of, we can, if we look at it, if we propose the business case in such a way that actually we can reduce the costs here, and we're making an investment here, then the delta in between the middle actually works out as what the cost of investment for exposure management is actually going to be. And that can be actually probably a better way to articulate the business case.
It can be a compelling argument as well. And the budgets are not really going to be that questionable. We have actually a question from Ukraine. So from Dimitro, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for the presentation. Will it be a separate product that will replace vulnerability management, and exposure management can just include that? This is a question, I guess, for Katie on the product capability. Or will it just be an additional module element to the existing WithSecure element solution?
Yeah, so it's designed to be a replacement. So under the hood, there'll still be the components of things like vulnerability management, like the existing scanner, that if we're talking about the specifics, the elements offered, but it will just contain much more than what vulnerability management had originally. So a layer on top of the vulnerability management will be something like a dynamic risk score. So that will apply things like threat intelligence, what vulnerabilities are we seeing exploited in the wild? Is there a proof of concept and things like that? So that will be applied to the output from vulnerability management and that module. And instead, we'll see a much more prioritized list that's based on this dynamic risk score instead of, what you traditionally get from the Elements Vulnerability Management product.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. We actually also have interesting questions on metrics. I love metrics because at least like for the arguments that I can do nowadays for the leadership team, metrics are very helpful, especially when we're talking about trends. When it comes to making a decision on the vulnerability or within exposure management, that vulnerability, what are the best tools that we have at the moment on threat intelligence? And somebody has been asking about if there are any region-specific tools, anything that we have.
Yeah, so just coming from experience from my team, really, we quite often will keep an eye on the CISO, commonly known exploited vulnerabilities list. So, when a vulnerability gets added to that catalogue, we know that attackers are actually exploiting that, and so it's probably something that we want to pay close attention to. Quite candidly, we use Twitter. If people are talking about a vulnerability on Twitter, then it's probably going to be exploited. X. Yeah, sorry. Is anyone really calling it X? But, yeah.
Elon Musk's question.
Get hate in the comments now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great source because, if people are talking about it, then it's probably going to be something that's on the attacker's radar as well.
Absolutely. Anything you want to add to that, Mo?
No, it just reminds me of the quote about if you don't like my metrics, I can bring you other ones. And also it just brings out, it's a level of maturity, right? And I do like the idea that actually with this, you're looking at metrics and trends, and trending is really important, right? So again, it's something else that you can supplement the leadership team.
And these feeds into exposure management as well, right? Like threat intelligence related information, commonly known exploited vulnerabilities from CISO, it feeds as well to exposure management.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Well, we have one interesting final question here regarding English food, and it was directed to me, but I direct it to you first. What's your favorite English food?
Ooh, great question. Fish and chips, I'd say. If we're talking purely British food, I would say fish and chips, yeah.
Well,
it's easily a Sunday roast with beef.
All right.
Good shout.
Excellent.
Or actually, I might trump that by saying all three. So in some pubs, they do 3 meats. So I would choose that.
Okay. Well, it used to be fish and chips for me when I was eating more animals, but now I'm easily with the English breakfast with a very nice juicy mushrooms, etc. So very nice food. But today we are at the last minutes of our webinar. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Mo, for joining me today and for allowing me to grill you questions related to exposure management. I at least feel like a little bit more informed, and I would definitely want to put it in my budget, note to the leadership team and CEO, and I would want to make sure as well that the different areas in the organization are brought in, because as mentioned, they need to own this. I'm sort of just the evangelist and governance related to this, but they would need to own this. And thank you as well to our audience for asking the questions today. Hopefully you also got away information related to exposure management that you can use later on in helping secure your organizations as well. It's a lovely day in London. Thank you so much for joining us, and till next time.